In the final pages of The Origin of Species, after Darwin had presented the theory of evolution by natural selection, he made a very bold prediction. He said, "In the distant future, I see open fields for far more important researches. Psychology will be based on a new foundation, that of the necessary acquirement of each mental power and capacity by gradation." More than a century later, a group of scientists, John Tooby, myself, Martin Daly, Margot Wilson, Don Simons, David Buss, we started to try to work out exactly how Darwin's fundamental insights could be used as a foundation on which to build a more systematic approach to psychology than what existed at the time. And we were motivated by developments from a series of different fields. First was the cognitive revolution, which provided a precise language for describing mental mechanisms as programs that process information. Then there were advances in paleoanthropology, hunter-gatherer studies, and primatology, which provided data about the adaptive problems our ancestors had to be good at solving to survive and reproduce, and the environments in which they did so. There was also research emerging in animal behavior, linguistics, neuropsychology, showing that the mind is not a blank slate, passively recording the world. Organisms come factory-equipped, if you will, with knowledge about the world, which allows them to learn some relationships very easily, and others only with great effort, if at all. So B.F. Skinner's hypothesis that everything that's in the head, it's like Thomas Aquinas, there's nothing in the intellect that wasn't first in the senses. His hypothesis that everything you do is caused by one or two simple learning processes governed by reward and punishment was simply wrong. There was more to it than that. And last is there was a revolution happening in evolutionary biology that placed the field on a more rigorous formal foundation of replicator dynamics. It clarified how natural selection works, what counts as an adaptive function, and what the criteria are for calling a trait an adaptation. These different areas, ethology had these two areas, what was called sociobiology had these three areas, evolutionary psychology all four, and the cognitive revolution being particularly important. We thought that if one were very careful about the causal connection between these disciplines, that these new developments could be pieced together in a single integrated research framework in a way that hadn't been exploited before because the connections ran between fields rather than cleanly within them. And we call this area evolutionary psychology, this framework. The goal of research in evolutionary psychology is to discover, understand, and map in detail the design of the human mind, as well as to explore the implications of these new discoveries for other fields. The eventual aim is to map human nature. And by human nature, I mean the species-typical information processing architecture of the human brain. So like all cognitive scientists, when evolutionary psychologists refer to the mind, they mean the set of information processing devices, embodied in neural tissue, of course, that are responsible for all conscious and non-conscious mental activity and that generate all behavior. And like other psychologists, evolutionary psychologists test hypotheses about the design of these information processing devices, these programs, using laboratory methods drawn from experimental, cognitive, social, and developmental psychology, as well as methods drawn from experimental economics, neuropsychology, cross-cultural fieldwork, whatever is relevant to answering the question that you're interested in. What allows evolutionary psychologists to go beyond traditional approaches in studying the mind is that they make very active use in their research of an often overlooked fact, that the programs comprising the human mind were designed by natural selection to solve the adaptive problems faced by our hunter-gatherer ancestors. Problems like finding a mate, cooperating with others, hunting, gathering, protecting children, avoiding predators, and so on. Natural selection tends to produce programs that solve problems like these reliably, quickly, and efficiently. Knowing this allows one to approach the study of the mind like an engineer, but working in reverse. We have working models in front of us, that is all of your brains, all of our brains, and we're trying to, instead of building a brain, we're trying to figure out how was yours engineered? What are the programs in your brain? So you start with, as an engineer, engineers always start with a good specification of the problem they're trying to solve. Am I building a bridge across a river? What am I trying to do? The same for us. The first step is to start with a good specification of an adaptive information processing problem. Then you want to do a task analysis of that problem that allows you to see what properties a program that's very well designed for solving this would have to have. What properties would a program have to solve the problem at all, let alone well? Doing that allows you to generate testable hypotheses about the structure of the programs that comprise the human mind, which then you, of course, go on to test in every way that you can with laboratory methods of various kinds. You want to maybe eventually find the program's neurological basis, test cross-culturally. Our students have maintained a field site in the Ecuadorian Amazon for a long time to do that. So from this point of view, there are some very precise causal connections that link the four developments that I just mentioned together into a coherent framework for thinking about human nature and society. The first is this, that each organ of the body evolved to serve a function. The intestines digest, the heart pumps blood, the liver detoxifies poisons. The brain is also an organ, and its evolved function is to extract information from the environment and use that information to generate behavior and regulate physiology. From this perspective, the brain is a computer. That is, it's a physical system that was designed to process information. It doesn't have the architecture of the computers you work on, but it was designed to process information. Its programs were designed not by an engineer, but by natural selection, which is a causal process that retains and discards design features on the basis of how well they solve problems that affect reproduction. Now, the fact that the brain processes information is not an accidental side effect of some metabolic process. The brain was designed by natural selection to be a computer, to regulate behavior and physiology. So if you want to describe its operation in a way that captures its evolved function, you need to think of it as composed of programs that process information. It's the other side. Neuroscience and cognitive science are two sides of the same coin. Just you can talk about you can talk about the brain as a physical system, which of course it is, and then you can talk about what that physical system is doing, how it's processing information. So the question, if you think of it as composed of programs, the question then becomes, what programs are to be found in the human brain? What are the reliably developing, species-typical programs that, taken together, comprise the human mind? The second is that individual behavior is generated by this evolved computer in response to information that it extracts from the internal environment of your body, of course, and the external environment, the physical environment, the biological environment, the social and cultural environment. To understand an individual's behavior, you need to know both the information that the person registered and the structure of the programs that generated his or her behavior. You can't just say the environment made me do it, because the same environment will make different species do different things. To take the most disgusting example, if there was a pile of dung, you and I would go, ugh, and we'd have a disgust expression and move away from it, but dung flies would go towards it, and the females would lay their eggs on it, the males would look for mates on it, the babies would hatch on it, and so on. It's the same stimulus in the environment, but it matters what the programs are in the species that you're talking about. So you need to know both in order to understand an individual's behavior. Now, the programs that comprise the human mind were sculpted over evolutionary time by the ancestral environments and selection pressures experienced by the hunter-gatherers from whom we are all descended. Each evolved program exists because it produced behavior that promoted the survival and reproduction of our ancestors better than alternative programs that arose during human evolution, during our evolutionary history. The reason evolutionary psychologists emphasize hunter-gatherer life is because the evolutionary process is very slow. It takes thousands of years to build a program of any complexity. There's a distinction between a complex mechanism. So if you think about the eye has all kinds of parts that have to fit together just right for you to be able to see. I'm talking about programs that are on that order of complexity. Things that are just simple quantitative matters like I'm taller, shorter, that can be pushed around more quickly in time by natural selection. But to build a program of any complexity takes a very long time to do. So the Industrial Revolution, or even the Agricultural Revolution, they're eye blinks in evolutionary time. They're too short to have selected for new cognitive programs, at least ones of any complexity. Now, although the behavior that our evolved programs generate would, on average, have been adaptive, and evolutionary biologists by adaptive mean reproduction promoting, in ancestral environments, there is no guarantee that it'll be so now. Modern environments differ importantly from ancestral ones, particularly when it comes to social behavior. We no longer live in small face-to-face societies in semi-nomadic bands of about 200 people, many of whom were close relatives. Yet our cognitive programs were designed for that social world, not for the world of anonymous mass societies that we live in now. The brain must be comprised of many different programs, each specialized for solving a different adaptive problem that our ancestors faced. That is, the mind cannot be a blank slate. So you can see this by using results from evolutionary game theory and knowledge of ancestral environments to define adaptive problems and do your task analysis. And when you carefully dissect the problem to see what features a program good at solving it would need to have, that's when it becomes clear that you're going to need specialized mechanisms for solving them. Our hunter-gatherer ancestors were on a camping trip that lasted a whole lifetime. You couldn't be helicoptered out. There was no modern medicine. That was your entire life. Everything that you ate because you hunted it or you gathered it, or somebody who did hunt or gather it gave it to you. They lived in small nomadic bands of just a few families. We came from savanna environments, grasslands with broken woodlands near them. They have certain features, like water is hard to get in savanna environments. One of the reasons we find in landscaping water very beautiful has to do with it being a rare part of the kinds of environments that we evolved in. You can't go to the grocery store and go to the deli counter and get cold cuts and meat at the deli counter because the meat runs away from you. It doesn't want to be eaten. And others want your meat. So you're competing when you kill something, you're competing with hyenas and lions and all kinds of scavengers to keep it for your family. Mothers were working mothers. They would take their babies with them and gather plant foods. They take their babies with them until they're too heavy to take and also bring back enough food. And for the first number of months of the baby's life, all of its nutrition is coming from being nursed. Hunter-gatherers often nurse their babies for up to 3, sometimes 4 years, not as their sole source of food, but a major source of food and water. There's no police. It's just your family and your friends for protection. This is a Yanomamo war party from Venezuela, and this is one of the largest ones that Napoleon Chagnon, the anthropologist who took the picture, had ever seen. About 30 people was the largest war party he ever saw. There are many dangers to you and your children. There's snakes, there's lions. I mean, there's horrible venomous biters. There's these scavenger guys. It's a very dangerous environment. It's not easy to survive and reproduce under these conditions. So to survive and reproduce on a camping trip that lasts your entire lifetime, our ancestors had to be able to solve many different kinds of problems well. And solving different problems well requires different evolved programs. It's a basic engineering principle that the same machine is rarely capable of solving 2 different problems equally well. So if you look at the heart, it has all kinds of parts to it that have to work just right and together to accomplish the function of pumping blood throughout your body. And it's no good at detoxifying poisons. Your liver has all kinds of properties that are well designed for detoxifying poisons, and your lungs are well designed for gas exchange. One of the reasons Swiss Army knives are so useful, right, is because they're not a general purpose tool. There's a lot of specific tools. There's scissors, there's corkscrew, there's a magnifying glass, and each one, it would be awful to try to cut paper with a corkscrew or to open a wine bottle with this or this. They're not designed for that, but you put them all together and you have a very flexible tool. The same principle applies to mechanisms that solve adaptive information processing problems. So consider 2 adaptive problems that require information processing for their solution: choosing nutritious food and choosing a mate. What counts as nutritious food? It's going to be a certain amount of proteins, fats, sugars in ancestral doses. You can't overdose on fat and sugar if you're a hunter-gatherer. Because the animals are running away from you, they're not fat. They don't have very much fat on it. That's a rarer resource. The sugar is coming from either fruit or honey. It's not like our modern environment. That's an environmental mutation. Choosing a mate, what counts? Somebody kind, intelligent, a good father, protects my children and me, and so on. An evolved program that's well designed for choosing nutritious food is going to have to embody different preferences and different inferences than one that's well designed for choosing a good mate. I mean, what if I use the same criteria I use for choosing food to choose a mate? In my case, I would be married to a very large, chocolate bar, probably not Hershey's, but dark chocolate, rather than John. It's just they're different in kind. Qualitatively different standards. Choices have to be governed by qualitatively different standards when you're choosing the right food, the right habitat, the right mate, and so on. Your motivations have to differ towards snakes and spiders, which are dangerous, but they're not predators of you, versus lions, which are predators and will stalk you, versus rabbits and antelopes, which are prey. You have to make different causal inferences about the behavior of objects, for example, inanimate things, versus the behavior of people, where beliefs and desires are part of the explanation of why a person's doing what they do. Consequently, to do all these things and do them well, the brain has to be composed of a large collection of programs, each specialized for a different adaptive problem. The same is true for any computationally powerful multitasking computer. Think about the fact that most of you probably write papers, so you write prose, and some of you probably also analyze data. Probably you have both Excel and Word on the computer you work on. Each one has different computational properties. Try to imagine writing a paper in Excel. It would be awful. Or try to imagine doing calculations in Word. You wouldn't be able to. There's no functions that do calculations in Word. They're just different in kind. They have different computational properties. So your computer has two programs to do those two things, and it does more because it has the two specialized programs. The more specialized programs, the more problems are solved on the computational devices that we use. Well, natural selection leveraged the advantages of specialization and the division of labor in building the mind. The evolved architecture of the human mind is composed of many different programs, each well engineered for solving a different ancestral adaptive problem. There are programs, some of these are things that we've studied versus other people have studied also. There are ones that are specialized for two-person cooperation, including trade. If you're interested in that, I'm going to talk about that with the economics and business students tomorrow. There are ones for group cooperation, collective action. Anger as an adaptation for bargaining for better treatment. There are adaptations for hunting and for foraging for resources, gaining and maintaining status. Courtship and mating, there's a whole area of evolutionary psychology about courtship and mating. Avoiding predation, protecting children, and so on. Specialization and the division of labor improve problem solving by the mind because these evolved programs, they're like expert systems in artificial intelligence. Each is equipped with rich, what you can think of as innate knowledge, problem-specific concepts, prior probabilities, default assumptions, and best bet strategies that reflect the physical, biological, and social world in which that program evolved. Just to give you I want to give you one small example of a specialization that involves reasoning. Instincts are usually often thought of as the opposite of reasoning. People often think that evolution erased all our so-called instincts and replaced them with reasoning, with a big R. They don't usually say what kind of reasoning. Do they mean procedures for logical reasoning, for probability theory, the Savage axioms, what kind of reasoning? That's usually left unspecified. But instincts are not the opposite of reasoning. Some of them cause reasoning. So this is the Charlie task from Simon Baron-Cohen. He's done a lot of work on theory of mind. For those of you in psychology, you probably know it. If you say to any 4-year-old, you say, this is my friend Charlie, and you say, which candy does Charlie want? Any typically developing 4-year-old will point to this one, the one that Charlie's looking at, and they'll say, that's the one Charlie wants. That's fine. That seems like that could be the kind of thing that you would learn just in an associationistic way by observing people in real life. But if you ask a person with autism that same question, which candy does Charlie want? Their answers are random. They might choose all 4, they might choose any one of them. They answer randomly. But if you ask the person with autism, which candy is Charlie looking at? They say this one. So a person with autism, they have the information about what he's looking at. They know exactly what he's looking at, but they do not use that information to make an inference about a mental state of wanting. There's a little circuit that uses information about eye direction to infer mental states, like wants. and that circuit's not functioning properly in autism, so people don't make the inference. We realize it exists when it's broken in some way, when it doesn't develop properly in the first place, and then the person's behaving strangely, and it's hard to identify why until you do the very carefully designed experiments to figure out what's going on here. Sometimes we realize that these specialized circuits exist when we discover that another animal doesn't make the same inference, or when we try to build a robot that does make that inference. So evolutionary psychologists are finding many specialized programs that cause inferences with the following properties. They're complexly specialized for solving an adaptive problem. They reliably develop in all normal human beings. They develop without any conscious effort. You don't have to think in an effortful way. It's not like learning calculus, inferring somebody what they want from what they're looking at. They develop without any formal instruction. You did not have to go to school to learn that. Some things you have to go to school to learn, not these things. They're applied without any awareness of their underlying logic, and they're distinct from more general abilities to process information or behave intelligently. These are all hallmarks that we usually associate with an instinct. So these evolved inference systems, they have these properties that we associate with an instinct, and they make certain inferences as easy, effortless, and natural to us as spinning a web is to a spider or building a dam is to a beaver. They're reasoning instincts. They're little programs that are causing reasoning about very specific things. These programs create and very powerfully structure our thought. So there's a mental division of labor. Many different programs that create a content-rich human nature. That is, each program knows, in a sense, a lot about the problem it evolved to solve and contains problem-specific motivations. A blank slate mind that was equipped with nothing other than content-free rational procedures like first-order logic or general probability theory, it cannot solve all the adaptive problems that hunter-gatherers faced for the same reason that a single person with no specific knowledge is going to fail to solve all the problems in an economy. That's an analogy I could use only here, because undergraduates in the United States would never understand the analogy, unfortunately. The last point that in the causal connections between these areas is that if you want to understand human culture and human society, you need to understand these domain-specific programs. They are among the things that you need to understand. They're not the only thing that you need to understand. There are emergent properties in the world, like the laws of supply and demand, that emerge from the interaction of many minds. But you need to understand these domain-specific programs. The mind is not like a video camera that passively records the world but imparts no content of its own. Domain-specific programs are organizing our experiences, they create our inferences, they inject certain recurrent concepts and motivations into our mental life, they give us our passions, and they provide cross-culturally universal frames of meaning that allow us to understand the actions and intentions of others. They cause us sometimes to think some very specific thoughts. They make certain ideas and feelings and reactions seem reasonable, interesting, and memorable. Consequently, they play a key role in determining which ideas and customs are going to spread easily from mind to mind and which will not. That is, they play a crucial role in shaping human culture. I'm now going to turn everything back. I'm going to turn it over, not back over, I'm going to turn it over to John now.
Another thing to understand about evolutionary psychology and how things might be different in the future is that people in the social science, we have this whole term, social science, as if it's distinct from the natural sciences, right? And that's because people didn't have any good, solid grounding, a starting place for studying the social sciences. So people developed various ideologies and various meta-theories and so on. But the thing about evolutionary psychology is that it comes out of the natural sciences, and that it's important to understand that evolutionary psychology is much more theoretically principled. And so you can have a structure of theory that explains a large amount of data, sort of like physics, and that you can derive some theories from other theories just in a very powerful way. And also, so it's not different. It's sort of, we're just a distant sub-branch of knowledge that comes out of, knowledge is unified, right, of foundational science. And so one thing that is just important to understand in psychology and in economics and in biology is that entropy is really a fundamental principle of science, that natural systems don't get any of their order for free. Okay? That natural systems left to their own devices deteriorate, go towards greater disorder. And so when you see something amazingly highly ordered like an organism, you have to say, where does that order come from? If you see something like an amazingly ordered economy, you have to say, well, where does that order exactly come from? How did that climb uphill from the normal state of things, which is deterioration and chaos, right? And we didn't understand this in biology until Darwin understood that natural selection is one thing that's consistent with physics, where naturally, if many random variants are tried replicate in the subset of things which are replicating physical systems, that those with improvements will become more numerous, and those that interfere with their own reproduction in some way or reproduce less well become less numerous. And so it's a self-executing filter which moves systems potentially uphill to higher and higher levels of organization. And so I was very lucky our family were friends with Max Delbruck, Nobel laureate in physics, and his friend Edmund Schrödinger wrote a whole book about what is life, which predicted the existence of something like DNA. Because in each organism's individual life, the organization has to already be there in some way, and he proposed a non-periodic crystal which had the genes in it, which is DNA. Anyway, so second law of thermodynamics is the first law of psychology. And so entropy seminar, and of course, the language deteriorates into gibberish with time, as systems do. So something has to be pushing uphill, okay, and to get all these organized systems. And so what this means is that the only kind of order you will find in the brain or in the living system is that's produced by natural selection. And it's the only kind of other things will be random with respect to function. And so this is inferential gold. You can just deduce a lot from this. And so you look at the mammalian eye, and it's got something like 2 million parts, and it's incredibly highly organized. And it's very hard, even artificially. Intelligence is another way you can increase order. You have a plan, you execute it, you make a piece of furniture that didn't exist before, or whatever. Okay, so this is a depiction of a space elevator made with super strong carbon molecules that people are planning, and who knows if it will ever happen. But the point is that we get super high up over the landscape of randomness into high organization with natural selection. And so you don't have to worry about where to start. You know to start with natural selection. And that gives you, with the organism facing some adaptive problem, it means the properties of the organism will be non-randomly well organized to deal with the adaptive problem in such a way that contributes to increased reproduction in the environment in which the organism evolved. So this is, like an enzyme is like a key in a lock, and that you can explain the parts of the enzyme by looking at the molecule it's supposed to operate on and change. So natural selection is positive feedback, right, on good design propelling its frequency. Anyway, and one common argument against this that people often make, sometimes even biologists, is that natural selection is a weak force. But, I like it when you can assess things with your own eyes. And so here are 3 different kinds of insects. And we know from the tree of life that these insects were all originally one single species, right? And so here they are, different lineages with different environments. And one major function, being small creatures, is how not to be eaten. And if you can't be detected, you can't be eaten. And so there's a leaf insect, and it does a pretty good job of looking like leaves, and a stick insect that does a pretty good job of looking like a stick, and so on. And so that's just, and one of my favorite examples is the leafy sea dragon, which you can see if you ever get to the Hawaiian, they have a really spectacular aquarium, and it's a fish, right? And it feeds on seaweed, and it lives in seaweed, and it's designed to, it's selected not to be visible to predators, to minimize to camouflage itself maximally. And not only does it look like kelp, but when you see it in the display, they have sort of artificial waves, and it's the rate at which it undulates just exactly matches the undulation of kelp. So it's spectacularly well designed. Okay, the argument that we have intuitively, and that is the foundation of the traditional paradigm in the social sciences, is that we have general intelligence, a general capacity to learn, maybe to learn culture, and that handles everything. And so we're receptacles into which our culture is poured, and that's all there is to you, right? So we know now with the rise of computer science that it's extremely hard to make general intelligence. Artificial intelligence of a general intelligence kind that you can talk to and it will reason things and so on. It's always 5 years away. It's been 5 years away since the early 1950s. And I think there's fundamentally mistaken about what intelligence is, but in any case, it's not here yet, despite hundreds of millions of dollars and very smart people working on the problem. And that's because in general, you need different solutions to different problems. And so there's not going to be a totally general solution to the problem of solving problems. So here is a product that somebody has brought to market, supposedly, and it's called Stop It. And it will stop your faucet from leaking, and it will stop a taxi when you want one, and it will stop an annoying person from smoking near you, and it will stop your baby from crying, and it will stop an elephant charging. Right? So buy Stop It, right? So it's a general solution, right? But it doesn't exist for the same reason. There's this just underlying principle of engineering, or principle of causation, I should say, that there's going to be particulars that you need dealt with, and that those particulars need something particular to move causally to produce a solution. And that's going to be different for different classes of problems. So we built into the social sciences for both intellectual reasons. It goes back to Aristotle, that there's nothing in the intellect was not first in the senses, but it also is powerfully supported by our intuitions, which is all these instincts are non-conscious. You can't look around the inside of your head and say, here's the incest avoidance instinct, right? It's just, you're not aware it's there. It just makes you feel certain things. It invites you to think certain things. Okay, so we are aware of the outputs, but we're not aware of the existence of these things, right? And it sort of seemed, and morally, they thought that if evolution shaped our minds, that somehow that would interfere with progress towards a better society. You wanted infinitely malleable humans, and it was thought that you get infinite malleability by taking away any particular structure from the brain. But clay, which you could make into any shape, it's not the thing which is doing the shaping, right? So something has to, in fact, be creating the structure. And the same way with things that we acquire in the course of trying to solve problems, that there has to be a guidance system, okay? The centerpiece that the social sciences grew up as this independent thing, social sciences and not natural sciences, was the idea of this blank slate, this general capacity, unspecified as it was, okay? And then it started to run into trouble because you can't really reconcile it with information theory and Shannon entropy, evolutionary biology, and really making computer programs. If you didn't know how the brain worked, you had no model at all, then you could think it could have all sorts of properties. But when computers came along and you could start to show how actual information processing structures had to take particular forms to reach outputs, then people started becoming increasingly aware that they had to have build in a lot of structure before the system would do anything. But still, this has a huge inertia as the dominant, overwhelmingly dominant paradigm in the social and psychological sciences. I came up with a diagram, and I'm fond of it, and it's probably a terrible diagram, but I'm going to show it to you anyway. But it might be helpful. So if you say, there's a psychological mechanism, okay, and we're going to ask two questions about it. One is it general purpose? How functionally generalized is it? Okay. And then another question you can ask is, how simple is the circuitry, right? So you have a 2x2 diagram and you can locate, and not in any precise way. This is purely heuristic, purely for teaching purposes, but you can locate any particular mechanism here, okay? So when Pavlovian conditioning came along, people could get a sense of exactly how that worked, in terms of inputs, outputs. And it was also highly specialized. You had, salivation and eye dilation and blinking, and there were a bunch of specific things, and then with a conditioning circuit thrown in. And so it was really simple, easy to understand. And psychologists excited, they said, this is all of human nature. So early behaviorists thought that Pavlovian conditioning was everything there was to say about humans. So not only was it a model of a particular mechanism in the brain, but they thought that was all of human nature, okay? Then Skinnerian, Thorndike law of effect, but Skinnerian behaviorists came along and they realized, consequences of a behavior also increase or decrease the likelihood of that behavior. If in certain things are reinforcing, food or water or sex or something like that, and that would increase. And so, with Pavlovian conditioning, we now have a complete model of humans. And not only that, we don't have to study humans anymore because all organisms are alike. There's general laws of learning. So we can look at the pigeon or we can look at the rat, and we can get all the information we need about humans because animal psychology is uniform, right? And so not only we just have only these two mechanisms which account for all of human behavior, but it accounts for all of non-human behavior as well, okay? But I want to say that what that means is that, it changes everything, including the old theory is that, first of all, culture is essentially everything, and it's poured into you. And thus, our evolutionary history is irrelevant because what's in your head is only what was there from poured in from birth. And there's nothing that you get from your brain, okay? And content comes only from your experience of the world. And this means anthropology is infinitely particularistic, and what happens in one place has no relevance to what happens in others. And our evolutionary history is one in which instincts were erased and replaced by a general capacity for culture. The new model is really different. So instead of having to learn the things which everybody has as part of their ordinary human nature, like the anger system or incest revulsion or warmth when somebody treats you well or you're liking to be approved of by other people. All these things are part of universal human nature. They're already there. They don't have to be taught by culture. What you have to teach from culture is locally particular kinds of information or calibration, and also, paradoxically, the things which are weird and not true. Like, you don't have to learn what a person is. You know that if you do something a person doesn't like, they may, bargain with you or they might be mad with you. And so if you have to be taught about ghosts, though, that they're here as dead people and they can float through walls. But you don't have to be taught that if you do something a ghost doesn't like, they might be angry with you. That comes with your model of a person, and it's part of your human nature theory of mind. And so it's a sort of, Necker-cube inversion of what culture is doing and why it's there. And so I think that we will come to see the social sciences as much more principled and very different than how we think of things now. And also, I just want to say that we're just at the very beginning. It's like there's a new continent and people have landed and they've, have a few beginning settlements, but there's this whole unexplored continent out there. People haven't been looking for these instincts, and now that we know they're there. And the other thing is that specific theories of natural selection give you expectations about where. So we were pretty confident there was going to be things having to do with genetic kinship, because the selection theories were there and they predicted their existence. So for students in psychology or any other field, I think over the course of your lifetime, it's really going to lead to a change in how people think about and understand things. Thank you.